Hello and welcome to this special year-ahead edition of On Point, a podcast series on the post-pandemic recovery, where we'll be discussing the top themes and events shaping 2022. My name is Arthur Krebbers. I'm joined by Jaspreet Singh and by Dean Shahfar, and together we'll be covering the top 6 themes affecting the corporate sustainability landscape going into next year. Let's get straight into it. ESG data democratization is seen as a crucial first step to supporting greater transparency in sustainable finance. What initiatives can help make ESG data available to the masses?
Thanks, Arthur. And certainly having good ESG data is key. And just to set the scene, in our Q4 2021 investor survey, over a third of investors cited that the lack of reliable ESG data remains their greatest barrier in their organization's pursuit of ESG investing. As a result, increasing the availability of comparable and meaningful ESG information, in other words, as you put it, Arthur, democratizing ESG data is essential in order to assess whether a company's sustainability strategy is truly working. We're hoping over the course of 2022, we will see an increased availability of freely accessible resources that will help us evaluate companies' sustainability performance. A good example of this is the Transition Pathway Initiative, which provides assessments of how companies are transitioning to net zero. In October, the TPI announced an ambitious plan to establish a global climate transition center, which is set to open in 2022 and will expand the number of companies assessed from 400 to 10,000, a 25-fold increase. It is also important to note that the regulation has a key role to play in this as well. For example, the EU introduced the Non-Financial Reporting Directive in 2014, requiring around 6,000 large companies to publish standardized reports on their ESG policies. In April 2021, the initiative was expanded to nearly 50,000 companies via the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, with the first set of standards to be adopted in 2022. So as you can see, overall, there's great progress and great momentum. And over the course of the next year, we hope to see greater availability of ESG data.
Excellent. Thank you, Jaspreet. And I guess besides concerns about data, I think there's also been growing concerns around the topic of greenwashing, particularly in light of what are sometimes considered quite opaque ESG data and processes. And I guess, Dean, looking ahead towards next year, how do you think that will be playing out?
Absolutely, thanks. So we think that greenwashing concerns will certainly intensify over the course of the years ahead. These follow a series of somewhat high-profile whistleblowing stories from organizations that have supposedly been making some questionable claims around their ESG practices. So with the concerns around greenwashing on the rise, we'd anticipate that investors and issuers will pay much closer attention to sustainability disclosure to make sure that the claims they are making stand up to the test of scrutiny. We think that ESG ratings will continue to play a key part in investor analysis, but perhaps some additional transparency will come to this market where it's typically been something of a black box. And we may see some consolidation in that market that's currently somewhat fragmented. So this isn't just about skepticism from investors. This is from all stakeholders and the companies themselves. It's likely to sharpen focus on companies that are truly additive to the outcomes they're trying to achieve.
Another theme that we cover in our year ahead piece is around this concept of a holistic decarbonisation plan. And Jaspreet, I think we've seen, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, large swathes of companies sign up to net zero goals and ambitions and initiatives. Why is that not enough in our view?
Certainly, we've seen a huge growth, as you say, Arthur, over the last 12 months, where we've seen a number of companies pledge net zero commitments alongside improvements in sustainability governance, transparency, and reporting mechanisms. Now, for the vast majority of companies, their own operations will actually only be a small proportion of their total environmental impact. If you look at the total value chain, Scope 3 is where the biggest percentage is. Climate Action 100 Plus is an investor-led initiative that monitors the ESG performance of the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters. At the end of 2020, only 10% of these companies that Climate Action 100 Plus tracks had net zero targets that included coverage of their most material Scope 3 emissions. So as a result, we're seeing growing scrutiny around net zero targets, and particularly in regards to Scope 3, because of how material it is. In order to address Scope 3 emissions, companies will need to collaborate with their suppliers and rely on their partnerships across sectors to deliver on broader decarbonisation targets. As a result, in 2022, we are likely to see supply chains play a more pivotal role within transition strategies in order for companies to achieve net zero.
And on the topic of decarbonisation, I think a market that's really grown in focus within sustainable finance is that of the carbon market, and indeed the role that carbon credits can play within at least a short to medium term decarbonisation pathway for many companies. Dean, how do we expect the carbon market to evolve next year?
We would expect the carbon market to continue to develop through 2021. It's gotten off to something of a slow start without any clear regulatory framework in the voluntary market. But as more companies look to set net zero targets for the year ahead, we would anticipate more companies using carbon offsets and carbon credits to achieve their reductions in the hardest to abate emissions. As more companies look to use carbon credits, we'd anticipate the cost of these to continue to rise. And that's particularly reflective of the point in time of the development of the technology. So nature-based technologies take a long time to develop, and scientific technologies are still in their infancy. We would also anticipate the transparency within the carbon markets to develop through 2022. So more companies can understand exactly what the return on each credit looks like and what activity they've chosen to work with.
And when it comes to the carbon markets, Dean, have there been any critical developments coming out of the COP26 conference?
Yeah, at the COP26, agreement has finally been made on Article 6, which, while not perfect necessarily, will give countries the tools they need for the environmental integrity of the carbon market. So this should involve agreement around double counting and the trail of ownership of these carbon credits. So it's a great development and represents a big step for how countries can start to think about how they're offsetting their emissions.
And building on this theme of decarbonisation and tools available for communicating one's decarbonisation strategy and targets, I guess quite critical as well is that we have a common understanding of what are green and carbon neutral technologies and projects. And I think that's where this concept of having a green taxonomy, as the EU and the UK are introducing, becomes quite critical. Just how do we think that will further evolve next year, these taxonomies?
Yeah, I think we're expecting to see great progress and great momentum heading into 2022. So next year, the EU taxonomy regulation will come into effect. Now, the EU taxonomy is a classification system that provides companies, investors, and policymakers with appropriate definitions for which economic activities can be considered environmentally sustainable. The regulation will require companies to report on their alignment with 2 of the 6 environmental objectives. These are climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Alignment criteria for the remaining 4 categories will be outlined in 2022 and enforced from 2023. In addition to the green taxonomy, the EU has signalled its potential expansion to include social factors. We anticipate to hear more details about the development of a social taxonomy over the course of 2022. Taxonomies of sustainable activities aren't exclusive just to the EU. As part of its Build Back Better report in the summer, the UK government announced the formation of a Green Technical Advisory Group that will oversee the UK's delivery of a green taxonomy. The development and application of sustainable taxonomies is very much seen as a positive and will increase firms' reporting obligations and result in sustainability criteria being better embedded within their financing instruments, and also give greater information to the market as a whole to be able to assess a corporate's ESG performance.
Thank you, Jaspreet. And you touched on indeed there that this piece of green financing instruments as well. And I think if we look at the expectations that we now have of companies in terms of their decarbonisation goals and investments, I think it's clear there is a major role here for green finance. And that of course emerged in the public markets, right, with the green public bond issuance. But we are starting to see momentum also in the private market. And Dean, on that point, how do we expect the private ESG market to evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, if we cast our mind back a few years, sustainable financing meant bond issuance. And since then, we've seen sustainability spread across the Treasury function. So we see it in public issuance, but also in loans and hedging products as well. And private financing is no different in that sense. So while it was the reserve of public financing, in 2021, we saw around 2 billion euros of ESG labeled private financing. This has been a function of improved disclosure and transparency so that investors can make very accurate decisions on the sustainability characteristics of private financing opportunities. So companies that are looking to raise financing in the private markets can now use a sustainability-linked structure, US domiciled investors can include sustainability into their mandates and are coming under increasing pressure to do so. So sustainability looks like it will continue to be a core driver in the private markets through 2022. And those issuers with strong ESG narratives that are well recognized with private placement investors will benefit from potentially a larger investor base and some improved execution dynamics, potentially reducing their cost of debt.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dean. Now, the past minutes, I think we've scratched the surface of these 6 core themes that we've laid out for corporates within the ESG universe for 2022. But do read our article, and we'd love your feedback and comments on the themes that we've outlined. And if you'd like to have more information around our insights for the year ahead, please go to the website ci.natwest.com/year ahead, and indeed follow us on social media. Thank you very much to Jaspreet and to Dean.